think we'll get started. It's right at 6 o'clock. I'm Dr. Paula Martin. I'm Director of GSW's Women's Studies program. Welcome to the 8th lecture of the Women's Studies lecture series. Tonight's symposium highlights the role of young women during the civil rights movement in America in the early 1960s. Tonight's event is presented by Dr. Susan Bragg. Dr. Bragg earned her PhD in 20th century American history from the University of Washington. She currently serves in the Department of History and Political Science as assistant professor here at Georgia Southwestern. Her research focuses on the long civil rights movement of the 20th century with an emphasis on the roles of women and the roles of young people. She is inspired by the stories of civil rights activism, as you will hear tonight from our guest speaker. It is the hope of Dr. Bragg, also of every faculty member at the Women's Studies, in the Women's Studies program, that you as students will be similarly inspired by these freedom struggles. Moreover, it is our hope that you will, in particular, be able to identify models of leadership within our own community. So, most Americans are familiar with the famous Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that back in 1954, which ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. Unfortunately, what we are less familiar with are the struggles to make this ruling meaningful in communities across the nation. Our guest speaker, Ms. Jewel Wise, her story is important. It's important because she reminds me that that struggle for integration was not easy and it was very long. She and other African American students became the ground troops of integration at America's High School in 1964. This is, by the way, 10 years after the Brown decision. While this group was a mixed group, Ms. Wise's story reminds us of the importance of young women in the civil rights movement. We're very fortunate to have as our guest Ms. Wise, who also is a GSW graduate. She's here to tell us what inspired her to activism during those early years, what her experiences were, what she went through, and what experiences shaped her life in the decades after that. Please help me welcome Dr. Susan Bragg and Ms. Jewel Wise.
Our plan for this evening is to do essentially a conversation with Ms. Wise tonight, to do a group oral history where my students up here in the front will be asking questions so that Ms. Wise can unfold her story for the rest of us. But I also hope that you are thinking about these kinds of issues because we're going to have lots of time for the audience to ask questions as well. And as Dr. Martin mentioned, Ms. Wise's story is important and it sheds real light on the nature of the civil rights movement here in Southwest Georgia. So I also want to thank Ms. Wise for coming, and I want to thank all of you for being here, and I hope that we will all be part of this conversation tonight. I'm going to actually just turn it over to my students right now and let them start. The only thing I want to note is we often celebrate civil rights movement without realizing how hard it was. That the culture of Jim Crow, the culture of racism and inequality was entrenched in Georgia from the 19th century through the 20th century. It meant economic discrimination against African Americans. It meant that African Americans had no political voice. It also meant no protections, basic civil liberties. It also meant that Georgia had over 450 lynchings in our history. So again, keep in mind how hard a civil rights movement is to recognize the significance of activism in this context. Civil rights activism is inspiring to all of us, and I'm sure it came at some cost, but it also has improved all of our lives too. And so that's where we want to let Ms. Wise tell her story. I'm going to start with my students, and again, we're going to let this conversation unfold, and I hope that you will all join in soon.
segregation, do you remember learning about where race being interviewed?
Maybe slow down and say that one more time.
Growing up during segregation, do you remember learning about where race being interviewed?
Good evening.
Yes, I guess I could start off by saying, of course, I knew what race meant because I was very aware of my heritage, so I knew that I was black. And I knew that there were other people who were not like me who were not.
Let me come over here. It's not translating as nicely as mine. Sorry, I'm gonna
That's okay.
have you.
Want this back?
Yeah, we'll see if this. Let us know in the back if you guys can hear better here.
Stand a little bit. Thank you for that question. As I was saying, when I was growing up, yes, I was very much aware of my heritage. I knew that I was black, and I knew that, you know, there were other people who were not. And so I was well aware of who I was. Mm-hmm.
Did you learn as a child what it meant to be black or what it meant to be white?
Well, yeah, I knew the difference, but when you say, did you learn as a child what it meant to be black and what it meant to be white? As a child, I learned that because of my color, I was thought of as a lesser person. And I was thought of as someone who didn't have any value because that's the way black people were treated during that era. So yes, I knew what it meant to be black and I knew what it meant to be white.
What do you remember about how segregation worked in Americas?
What I remember about segregation and how it worked in Americas was that it worked very well. That things were definitely segregated. They were different. There were, you know, places that I was not allowed to go, or people of my color were not allowed to go. Black people, African American people could not go. There were things that we could not do because of our color. We couldn't eat in the restaurants. White establishments, white restaurants, we could not go. We could not even go to the library. It was for whites only. We could not go to the schools. We could not go to churches. White people could come to our churches, but we couldn't go to their churches. So yes, I do know. I remember how it worked in Americas. It worked very well.
Do you remember any violence or dangers related to segregation or racial inequality when you were growing up?
I'm sorry, do I remember any violence? What
Do
question?
you remember any violence?
Oh, yes, and yes, I do. There was always something that was violent, and there were a lot of accusations of things that were said that black people did that they may not have necessarily done. I remember a really violent situation of a family here in Americus, Georgia. I don't know if any of you know of the Rosa Ingram case. It was the case, a situation about a black lady who lived in Americus, really on the outskirts of Americus, who was who got into I think it was an argument with a white person. I don't know if I think it had something to do with land or animals or something, and the white person attacked her and beat her up really bad, and her sons found out about it and they got involved, and as a result of that, one of her sons struck the man who was attacking his mother in the head, and he died, and it caused, it was a very widely spread case of, abuse and violence, because they attacked her because of some animals. So I don't know if you all have read about that story, but you should probably look it up and read about it and get more details. I'm sure there were
I remember
others.
you actually talked to me about this, the Rosalie Ingram case. The Ingrams were convicted of murder
Right.
in self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had mentioned to me that your family knew Ingrams, and this became part of your family's stories, that you essentially learned how to be active by learning about those stories.
Absolutely. They were a part of, Miss Ingram was in my family. Her daughter married my uncle, my mother's brother. So, even though I was very, very young, you hear things, and as you grow older and you continue to hear those things, you want to know more about those stories. So I was, I learned, sometimes when you're younger, your parents don't, may not want you to know the details of the stories, but as I grew older, I learned more about it. And it was a lot of violence going on at that time. There were other things of violence, police violence, growing up, police brutality, where black people got beat up for whatever. So there was, I learned of it. I knew about it when I was growing up, and as I got older, I learned more about it.
Who are people in your life who encourage you to speak up or think about the treatment of African Americans in America?
I'd say my parents, because my mother and father, they always wanted us to be active, particularly in the community, in the church. And so they taught us to speak up, and I think I would give my sister, though, most of the credit, because we were always together. I was a younger sister. She was probably 3 years older than me, but she always, wanted me to be my best, and she was a good role model for me. And she always told me to speak up and, say what I really felt and express myself. So I learned a lot of that from her. She was very active and she was very vocal.
What's her name?
Gloria Wise is her name, and I'll mention her a little later. She was, she was one of, she was do y'all want me to go ahead and tell about her? Now that you brought it up. My sister was Gloria Wise. She's deceased now, but Gloria was the first African American students to matriculate on this campus. She came here during the summer of 1965. She was a student at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, but she wanted to take a summer course. So she came to Georgia Southwestern and she took that course. And there was no incident of violence when she was here. She came during that summer, just during the summer, and she was brought out here and dropped off at school, and she took a course, and all during that summer that I remember, she didn't have any incidents of any violence, anything happening with her. And she was also very much active in the civil rights movement, too. She was one of the 4 women that I'm sure you've heard who stood in the voting line. In America's, as I've said before, it was very segregated, and we had 2 voting lines. When you went down to the courthouse to vote, there, if you were black, there was a black line, men and women, and there was a line to vote in for white women. And my sister got in the line for white women, and she was thrown out of the line, and eventually she and 3 other women, Mrs. Campbell, Lena Turner, and Mary Kate Fisher Bell, they were all put in jail and kept in jail for trying to desegregate the lines, or trying to vote in a line that was for women. I put it like that. You're welcome.
What made you and your parents decide, you or your parents decide that you should enroll in America's high school?
Well, that was a freedom of choice. I think they said that we had a freedom of choice. At the time, I was going to Sumter High School, and we found out I'm not sure how, I think it may have been through a mass meeting or through some of the leaders in the community who told us that any student at that time had the choice of staying where they were, either at America's High, wherever we were going to school at that time, or we could come to America's High, and I chose to come to America's High. I asked my parents, I talked to them about it, and they said that it was okay with them, and so I came.
And how did you prepare for this?
And how what?
How did you prepare for this?
How did I prepare for going to America's High?
Yes.
Oh, well, there was really no preparation, because how do you prepare to get rocks thrown at you, to get people throw spitballs at you, to get, knocked down the steps in the hallway? How do you prepare for that? You just prepare your mind that these things could happen, and I was never brought up as a violent person, and my parents never taught. We were never taught, even growing up. We were just never taught to be violent people, and I knew that, I just could not fight back. I mean, unless, there were some incidents where some students had to fight back. They had to, if a white student there were incidents where students walked up and did a lot of things to students, and they had to fight back. But I remember being at America's High, and I was in a class of all white boys, and we had a split class. And every time I would go to class, during that split, it was lunchtime. So during lunchtime, when I would go to lunch and come back, I stopped going to lunch because it was not safe for me to go to the lunchroom with the rest of the students, and I was alone at the time. And when I say I was alone, because I was in a different grade, there was another black student there, some other black students there, but they weren't with me when I went to lunch. So my lunch break was at a different time. And every time I would come back to class, my books would be in the trash can, or they'd just be removed from my desk where I could not find them. So, and there was no use in telling anybody, because we didn't get any help. We didn't, I think one teacher said to me, I had a male teacher also who said, I told him that my books were not on my desk when I returned. And he just shrugged his shoulder, like, so.
I have a follow-up question on that.
Yes.
When you started, did you see any change over the 4 years you were in school, or did it remain so difficult?
I was there 2 years, and I didn't see any change. However, there were students who did come after I came. They came the second year. There was a group of students who came the second year, and then the rest of the years behind me. But at the time, while I was there, I did not see any change. You're welcome.
You were one among 4 black students to attend America's High School. How did the other black kids respond to you? How did they treat you? Did they encourage you to keep going to the school, or did they not understand why you would do this?
Well, I really think that they didn't understand why I would do that. Why would I want to go over there and get beat up and get spit on and endure some of the atrocities that we endured while we were there? I'm sure they wondered. I really did not have a whole lot of, I didn't accept, movement, being involved in the movement, I didn't have a lot of interaction after that. It's like they just, I'm sure they wanted, I know they were saying, some of them in their hearts, that I wouldn't dare go there because I wouldn't want to have to endure what you've endured by being one of the only, or few black students there. So and then I think at some point later on in life, somebody just said, you left us. I just remember one student say, you left us. But that's about the only reaction that I remember anyone speak to me in regards to leaving Sumter High School. But they, later on they invited me to the class reunions, and of course I wasn't invited to America's High, but my friends who I had left behind invited me to their class reunion. And I'm still a part of their class reunion, and now the president.
I want to ask you that again one time for everyone.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever been invited to an America's High School reunion?
I've never been invited to an America's High School reunion. Never even talked to anybody except, one person I met recently, who told me that he remembered me being at America's High, and that's about all he said, but never. Mm-mm.
Did you gain any white support during your time at America's High School?
None at all. I didn't get any white support. The teachers weren't supportive. They seemed to have been angry all the time by the look in their, by their countenance. There was one student, who wanted, you could tell she wanted to be friendly. She wanted to be nice to me. And she was. She'd speak. She'd say good morning. She just tried to make, a little conversation with me before some of the other students got in the class. And, but no sooner than they started calling her names, she stopped. She stopped in her tracks. She never spoke to me again. They would call her bad names.
Did more African American students enroll after you?
Yes, they did. I think in all the grades after that, they began to enroll.
Were you able to participate in any sports activities?
No, we weren't able to. And I tell you, my first year, I didn't really want to participate in anything because at one point in time, because of the violence, because of the students, there were some students who were always bad. They wanted to fight. They wanted to throw things. They were always calling me names and spitting on me and throwing books and things at me. And they, and so that we had, my point was, I was trying to think of what I was trying to say. We had to be let out of class. We had to try to get to school early, and I had to be let out of class 5 minutes early so that I would not run into the crowd, because at that time, I believe there was, I had to go out of the side door down some steps, and there was one young guy who always wanted to meet me at the bottom of those steps, and he always picked up whatever was laying around that he could hit me with, and he was always trying to fight, and somebody had to always stop him, maybe a teacher, but he always wanted to be violent and always wanted to beat me up. But no support from the teachers, none whatsoever. It was like, you shouldn't have come, So nobody tried to, if I tried to tell them that, somebody threw a spitball at me or somebody spat on me, it was received like, you shouldn't be here. And one teacher even blurted out and referred to me as a Martin Luther Coon in the class. I was sitting in an English class, and she just, all of a sudden, she was talking about the English class, and all of a sudden she just said, looked at me and, really, and said, you're Martin Luther King Coon. you shouldn't have come here.
While you were part of the process for integration in local high schools, other forms of protests was also happening. How did you get involved, or did you get involved in other civil rights protests or movements?
Okay, the first part of that question, I'm sorry.
While you were part of the process of integrating the local high schools, other forms of protests were also happening.
Mhm.
How did you, or were you involved in other?
Yes, I was involved in, I'd say, most of the young people who were involved in the civil rights movement were very young. We were all, I think, as young as, I don't know, 12 or 13 years old. And we just became active. I know my family was very much active. My sister was active in Atlanta, and when she came home during the summer, she was very much active. And we did a lot of things as young people. We were the movement, the young people. We did things like we helped with voter registration. We helped people who didn't know how to read. We helped them to learn how to read. We helped get out and register people, encourage people to get out and vote. We even had a newspaper called The America's Voice, and it was written by young students, young people who didn't necessarily have any, writing experience, but we wrote all the articles in there. We wrote articles about what was going on in the community, and a lot of things were going on at that time. So as a young person, I was very, very much active all the way from, I guess, about 12, 13 years old up to now.
What do you think influenced other young people to get involved? Did you ever hear any criticism from African Americans about civil rights protests?
Well, yes, a lot of young people did get involved, and I think what influenced them is that I think as more people became involved, others got involved. Yes, if some kids weren't okay. A lot of parents allowed their children to get involved, and some did not allow their children to get involved. Some parents were threatened by their bosses, the people they worked for. There were a lot of domestics in Americas, people who were domestics, and there were a lot of people who worked for people with companies, and they literally told them that if you get involved in that mess, then you'll lose your job. So a lot of people were afraid, and they didn't want their children to get involved with the movement. So they weren't allowed to, get involved. They weren't allowed to picket. They weren't allowed to protest. They weren't allowed to do any of that. Of course, some children, they snuck out of the house and they got involved anyway. Some of them got in trouble, but my parents weren't like that. They allowed me to be involved. They allowed me because they knew that, what I was doing was for the sake of freedom. It was for the sake of others who were not allowed to do it. It was, it was just the right thing to do, because the only thing we were doing was trying to fight for freedom. And so we didn't, and I say use the word fight, but we didn't do any fight, and we weren't violent at that time. We, a lot of the leadership was people who worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is called SNCC. And we were, when people came down to help, of course, some people in the community called them outside agitators, but they were just people who were coming down to help us in the community. They were people you know, they might have been students, they could have been people who graduated, they could have been other students from other colleges, all kinds of colleges, Ivy League colleges, because there were a lot of people who did come to Americas and they wanted to help with voter registration. They wanted to help, you know, whatever we were doing, they wanted to be a part of that. To start programs for the children, to have reading programs, and we had what was called a freedom school, and it was where we taught a lot of things. People learned a lot of things in those freedom schools. They learned things that they wouldn't ordinarily learn just because they lived in Americas, because it was a very segregated place, and as I think I said it before, we couldn't even use the library, and there was a young lady who came to Americas, and she helped set up a library down at what is now, what used to be the old colored hospital. We made it into a youth center. You know, we cleaned it up, and we set up areas where young people could come and play. They had a library there. We set up a library, and people donated books from all over the country, and they sent books to America, so we had books to read. And they had typing classes. They had all kinds of, we had all kinds of things going on that would help the community, you know, during that time. So, did I answer your question? Okay.
Were there more men than women, or was it about equal?
I think I can say that it was equal. There were a lot of women who came down. They were, like I said, students they came from everywhere. My family housed a lot of students who came down. When students came down and, you know, we knew that they were coming, a lot of times they may have been sent from other organizations in other places. CORE, SCLC was also involved. Congress of Racial Equality, that organization was involved. So people would come from different organizations, and they came to help to do whatever was needed to be done. And they came down, and there were students, and like I said, there were guys and there were girls. There were men and women who came down and spent a lot of time. Sometimes they spent whole summers, and sometimes they stayed a little longer than that. And they did whatever was needed. And they participated just like local people. They were beat up just like local people, and some were beaten very badly. And so they really got involved. So, yes.
What experiences did you have with public protest in the 1960s?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
What experiences did you have with public protest in the 1960s?
What experience that I had? I would picket. I think as young people, all of us got involved in protesting and picketing. We picketed places that were segregated, places that had never hired. I mean, we spent our money in the grocery stores, but we were not allowed to work there. I mean, black people couldn't work there. They couldn't find a job, couldn't get a job. And so we protested and picketed places like the grocery stores and mostly the grocery stores and probably some of the restaurants and places like that. So we just wanted, you know, equality. We felt like if we could spend all of our money in these places, that we should be able to get a job there to feed our families, because, you know, there were very few jobs and people couldn't feed their families and they needed work. So, did that answer your question? Okay.
How did the police and the white community respond to your activism?
How did?
The police and the white community respond.
Oh. They responded with billy clubs and with dogs, with water hose. You know, they We got beaten. We were run down with water hose. Dogs were sicked on us when we picketed, when we marched. And some were beaten, and there was a lot of police brutality, and some were beaten worse than others. And so a lot of times we just had to run for our lives. A lot of times we had to run for our lives, or bear out the beating. Sometimes we didn't run. Sometimes we just took it.
Your sister attended GSW in the 1960s and you graduated with a degree in sociology from GSW. How did you feel about GSW in the 1960s when it was also in the process of integration?
Okay. Well, my sister attended Georgia Southwestern, and right about the same time I started going to America's High School, but that was nothing that we planned. I came to Georgia Southwestern, I think before my sisters attended Georgia Southwestern. I really didn't know that there was a college here. I mean, when I was growing up, I may have learned it later on, maybe when the civil rights movement really got active and people came to Americas and we started learning, because we were kind of limited. We couldn't go to too many places. And let me see, I think it was later on that my father had transportation, but we didn't, it's not like we walked around the community and we knew where everything was. We knew that there was college. I honestly didn't even realize. I asked somebody else that same question. Did you know that the Georgia Southwestern was here when you were growing up? And they said they didn't know anything about it. So I didn't really know that there was a college until later on, probably pretty close to the time when I was thinking about going to college. Mm-hmm.
Did you feel that faculty or the administration at GSW wanted to integrate or maintain segregation?
Probably at that time, I would say, I'm not sure if I can say exactly when, but that was probably a time when they wanted to maintain the status quo. And then, I mean, there might be some other students who may have a difference of opinion when they decided to come here. Like I said, I don't remember any incidences with my sister when she came in 1965, that summer. So, I'm not sure. But I'm sorry, who's talking? Okay, go ahead.
Come as the major point of success for the civil rights movement in America's Georgia.
Okay, I'm trying to see who's talking. Oh, you're talking, okay. Okay, go ahead, sweetheart.
What do you count as the major points of success for the civil rights movement in America?
Before the civil rights movement in Americas, we had a very low number of registered voters. There were about 300 African Americans who were registered to vote. And but after the civil rights, after everything that went on, all the hard work and stuff that went on here in Americas, it brought it up to about 3,000. 3,000 registered voters in Americas. And I think, for one thing, we probably weren't allowed to vote. And then also, because of that number of registered voters later on during the movement, it changed a lot of things. Black people were able to run for political offices, and they were received in doing so. After the civil rights movement of the 60s happened, it was it was a lot easier to run for an office. As a matter of fact, one of the women who was jailed for getting in the women's line at the courthouse was Mary Kate Fish Bell, who ran for Justice of the Peace at that time. And, but before that time, she probably would not have been able to do that successfully. Did that answer your question? Okay.
What do you think are points for improvement or continued activism to create real equality in America?
I think one of the things that I feel could improve and create improvement. One point okay, let me say this right. To answer your question, did everybody hear what she said? What do you think are points for improvement or continued activism to create real equality? Well, I think one thing I feel is that if young people, you students of today, don't become, that you become active and what's the word I'm trying to think? You don't become, I just hope that, you know, a lot of you who are sitting out there listening don't feel like, well, that was them, you know, that was their fight. And, you know, it really doesn't involve me. I hope that, you know, that the baton can be passed on, that you will get involved and get involved in things that matter to Americans of whatever community you're from. Get involved with voter registration. Get involved with those things that really matter to make a community, you know, what it should be. Whether it's voter registration or, you know, just be active and not just think, well, you know, that happened to them back then, because remember, history repeats itself. I hope it doesn't in this case, but it does. And if you'll just get involved and not just feel like, you know, that doesn't involve me, it doesn't, what happened to her doesn't concern me, it doesn't involve me, but, you know, you never know. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. I know you mentioned you had a few comments that you wanted to make. Would you like to open up to the audience first, or would you like to make any final remarks?
Yeah, let's open up to them first.
Okay, so
and
we'll
then
actually
I'll make my final.
let you all, if you have any questions, raise your hand. I will come and bring this microphone up to you. Any questions for Ms. Weiss? Do you have another question? Yeah.
Did any of the protesters against integration ever come to your home and try to harm you?
No, I don't remember anybody doing that. Mm-mm.
That
Not
did
me.
happen in other areas.
Yes,
in
it
this
happened in
region,
other
but not-
areas,
Yeah.
yes.
You mentioned that your sister was jailed. Were you ever jailed?
I was jailed for picketing and marching in front of on the side of, there were two entrances to the Martin Theater. That was, at that time, was downtown Americus on Forsyth Street. I think it's where the, well, anyway, right there on that corner. And we were picketing because the front entrance was just for white people, and the back entrance is where we had to go in order to see the movies. We had to go down through a back alley where we had to pass by a bar and go up some stairs, and it was narrow, very narrow. And, you know, if a fire had occurred in that place, you know, people would have gotten burned. But this is where we had to go. We had to sit up in the balcony. And so we were protesting that because we felt like we should be able to go through the front door and watch movies. We paid money just like everybody did. And we just felt like we should be able to go through the front door. But that's what I was picketing for when I was arrested in Americus.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions?
Costner here?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
What would you say are modern issues today in America that you would like to be addressed?
Education is one. To talk a little bit about America's High, when I was going there, well, you know, things change. If anybody knows anything about America's High, now that it's almost all black, practically all black, because white people send their children. A lot of them have sent their children to Southland, or they send them to Sly County High School, and so there's not. I guess it's, I don't know, you could say it's still segregated. So, but things in education is very important. There are issues with education. There's still job problems where, I don't know, we just don't, it doesn't seem like there are enough jobs. But there probably needs to be job training. And mostly education is what I'm concerned about. Kids dropping out of school, and they need to stay in school. They need to stay. They need to get their education.
Dr. Tate?
Thank you for sharing a really remarkable story. I can't help but feeling heartbroken about what you experienced, and I wonder two things about that. In choosing to endure the treatment instead of leave, were you conscious that you were making a choice for change and that you were doing something very political? Or were you stubborn? and for your parents, were they aware of the extent of the abuse? And I'm sure that must have been tremendously heartbreaking for them. And how did you as a family reconcile that choice when it was so painful?
Okay, let me see if I can assimilate that question. My parents were aware because when I went home every day I talked about it. My mother was always there. My father was away because he had a job working on the railroad where he worked out of town during the week. But when I went home in the afternoons, I'd tell my mother about it. And yes, I wanted to affect some change. It did get very hard, and I did not graduate from America's High School. There were students who came the second year who did stay, and who were the first 3 African-American students to graduate from America's High. I didn't stay because I did not like the treatment. I went because the books that I used at Sumter High School was substandard. They were always used old books. And I went there with the notion of getting a better education, but it was hard to get an education with all those annoyances and all those things that those kids were doing to me. So when my sister graduated from Spelman, I just asked her could I come and live with her, and I left Americas. Was there another part of that question?
I just wondered about the political statement. It was an incredible personal sacrifice on your part to do that, and I wondered how much of the desire to make change versus, as you explained, the desire for a better education. You really put yourself in a really horrible situation for your education. I wasn't sure how you reconcile that with your family.
Well, I knew that that I was going to go through some things, but you never really know how bad it's going to be until you actually get there and you're a part of it. But after it continued, day after day, week after week, month after month, and you just get to a point where you just get tired and you say, what the heck? The doors, at that time, the doors were open. I felt like the other 3 students and I broke the ice. Maybe it wasn't as wonderful as I thought it was going to be, because, not that I thought it was going to be wonderful, but I expected to get a good education, but it was hard to, to learn under those circumstances. So it was very hard. So
It speaks very well of how important education was to you even as a young person.
right, and it was very important.
Thank you. Any other questions?
All right, thank you for doing this talk. In terms of religion and politics, do you recall like what role possibly African American churches played in getting out the vote and African American vote mobilization?
Yes, the African American church played a very significant part in, they were just involved because they were always involved, because whenever we wanted to have a mass meeting, the churches always got involved. They, people, the minister, the pastor, the ministers always got involved because, they had people too who needed to be registered to vote, and they got involved, and they got their church members involved, those who wanted to be involved. So the church played a very significant part in voter registration and activism in the civil rights movement. Did that answer your question?
What would you say to people that claim that white privilege doesn't exist today?
White privilege doesn't, what exactly? Are you saying that there are people who say that?
Right, like people deny that there's a wage gap between white people and other minorities and black people. There's just a high percentage of African Americans in prisons in relation to their percentage as a population. And a lot of people claim that this inequality doesn't even exist, that the civil rights movement is over. So what would you say to those people?
I'd say it's never over. Civil rights is never over because, it boils down to really, human rights, not just civil rights, but also human rights for everybody. Now, I'm not sure I understand the first part of your question when you said, what I say to people who deny. Could you say that part again?
They simply deny that there's not an issue now
Okay.
when there is.
Mm-hmm. There is. I would say there is an issue, there's always an issue because, and by virtue of the fact that they're denying that there's an issue, we know that there's an issue because we know that that's not true. They know that things are not yet equal. They just aren't. So
A question over here?
they need to be real.
Okay, over here.
Hello. In 1963, there were young ladies that were hauled off to prison cell at the Leesburg Stockade. Do you remember that event? And what was the community response to that situation?
There were females who were in several prisons. Leesburg Stockade was just one of them. There were young women who were in the Dawson Stockade. They were just wherever they took them. And eventually, leadership would find out where, sometimes it may have taken a while for them to find out where they were, but the way the movement was set up, it was set up so that if young people were jailed somebody would always know where they were. And so they were everywhere. Not only young women, young men. And as I told you before, all of us were very young. All of us were young. So we knew that if we picketed, we knew that it was likelihood that we would be jailed. We knew that the police were ready to put us in jail. And whatever. We knew we were going to jail. So it was horrible because all of these, all of us were young, and it was bad for a young woman to be in jail. It was bad for the young men who were in jail because there were a lot of young boys who were in jail also. But it was all of it was very horrible. It was a horrible experience for anybody who had to go to jail that time, and we were all young kids and hadn't done any crimes. So it was horrible. And the response of the community is that it was a horrible thing, and some parents were able to go and get their children, not a lot of them, but a few of them were able to go and get their children out of jail. And there were some who could not because they wanted to put up a bond. Yes.
Any other questions here? Question down at the bottom.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that a lot of the whites in your community were very stagnant as far as their position when it comes to civil bullying, like discriminatory bullying. Were you ever angry at whites as a whole, or were you just like?
Of course, yes, I was angry. It made me very angry, that somebody would pick on me and push on me and do mean things to me for no cause, that I didn't do anything to them, but they just be mean to me because of my skin color. Yeah, that made me very angry. I didn't like it at all. It made me angry, of course. Yes.
We have another question up front here too.
Mm-hmm.
One of my colleagues wanted to know if you ever met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during this process.
Well, to be honest with you, I did not meet him personally. He did come. Well, he was jailed in America. He was right, but I didn't meet him personally because I believe they got him out of the jail and sent him somewhere else. But no.
You said you were jailed. How long did they keep you?
I stayed in jail. It was probably I believe it was 8 days. It was a group of other young people. It wasn't me alone. It wasn't me by myself, but there were other students who, were put in jail at the same time I was. We were jailed, and we were fed. I think it was like the usual jail menu was a hamburger, maybe 2 hamburgers, cold hamburgers. And that was our food. Maybe some cold grits or something like that. But yes, and jail was very hard for any young person back during that time. It was very hard. We were not adults. We were not criminals, but we were treated as criminals. So it was very hard.
My last question. Did you lose any personal friends? Like while you were studying, or
I think I don't know if I could say I lost friends, but I did lose contact with a lot of people. But they embraced me because now, I'm a part of the students who I started out in high school with at Sumter High, and right now I'm class president. So I think I kind of lost touch with them for a few years, but later on in life, when I moved back home, I got reconnected to my friends. As a matter of fact, they invited me to their first class reunion, and so they kind of stayed in touch with me. And, you know, being, living in a small community where everybody is close and, you know, people gonna wonder, where are you, what are you doing? And, you know, let's invite her to the class reunion. And that's what they did. And I thank them for doing that. Otherwise, I never would have gone to a class reunion. Mm-hmm.
Today there's like social expectations, especially like black people, like how to behave in certain instances, or how to dress, how to like not bring attention to yourself. Like what were the social expectations of at the time? Like today, like some parents tell their kids not to sag their pants because it makes them look a certain way. But like what was during the time, like your time, like what would be the way that you would be presenting yourself respectable in the community?
Well, you know, we were all brought up in church. Our parents were Christians, and if you know, if you were a young lady, of course, you were taught to dress respectably, not to wear your dress too short, and you know, and keep yourself covered properly in the right places. So it's you know, just be respectable. Parents just taught their children and their girls that. I don't remember seeing any baggy pants back in the day. I like you see them now way below where they're supposed to be. I don't think parents would have young people back. You know, I'm gonna tell you something about the young people back in my day. They were very respectable. They, if their parents told them not to wear their pants like that, or I'm not saying everybody, but I don't remember. I just don't remember baggy pants hanging below the behind. I just don't remember that. Now, girls wore short dresses, but then it was up to their parents to tell them, you know, what to wear. But that baggy pants is just one thing I don't remember.
I mean, like, was there like a specific like stereotype that you were encouraged not to embody when in the presence of your white peers?
Oh, that's what you mean. In the presence of well, I just from what I remember, I was just do you have any something that you can you know what I mean? Do you have an example? Yeah.
Well, one example that I've actually heard of in this context is that young women were often discouraged from wearing jeans when they went out to march, because that was seen as disrespectful, that you should wear your Sunday best when you went out to march. And that wasn't always the case.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of varied by area and by community.
Okay.
But I think that's sort of what Costner's thinking. Is there a way that you sought to present yourself to the white community to show your resistance, essentially your pride in yourself and what you were doing?
To be honest with you, I just don't remember anything like that. It may have been going on at that time, but I don't remember anything about, you know, wearing jeans or whatever. You know, as to present yourself, to make yourself presentable in front of white people, I don't remember. There may have been, but I just don't remember.
Question over there?
Huh.
Did you have a social life outside of trying to solve the issue?
That's a very good question. A social life. No. Not really. When you say social life, I'm taking that you meant did I date? Did I personally I didn't, because my parents were strict. I couldn't date until I graduated from high school. But we had a little social life. you know, we weren't involved in a lot of social things in Americas because, you know, we couldn't go swimming. There were no recreational centers for young black children. There were just nothing. There was nothing. But I remember when the civil rights movement started in Americas, for relaxation and for having something to do, we used to go to the Cornelius Farm. We used to be friends with the Jordans and the Whitcampers, the families out there. And so for recreation, we go out there, and Dr. Clarence Jordan used to take us on hay rides out in the woods, out in the country. And that was the only form of recreation that I remember back in those times that we had until I left Americus, Georgia. That was just really nothing, no recreation for us, nothing. There was, I think I alluded to what used to be the America's Colored Hospital. When they stopped using that as a hospital, we started using it. We made a recreation center out of it, and we used to go there and have dances. I mean, they used to have dances, and of course, if it was in the daytime, I could go, but if it was not, I couldn't. So a lot of young people were able to, you know, have friends that they could go dance and sit around and whatever. At that place. That was the only form of recreation that I remember growing up. Anybody else?
Well, I really thank all of you for coming, and I know that Dr. Martin.
No, I was just going to thank you all for coming and for supporting the Women's Studies Speaker Series and the Women's Studies program in general. Thank you, and thank you so much, Ms. Jewel Wise.
Thank you for having me.
Like Ms. Wise.
Absolutely. Power
Thank you.
numbers.